Hello class, today I want to try to do a little clarification on some things. Our last paper was about rights, as it turns out. So I'm going to do a bit of a comparison between rights and utilitarianism and another ethical principle called deontology. And actually the history of this is that the idea of rights comes first through John Locke, and the idea of deontology comes from a fellow by the name of Immanuel Kant, and finally utilitarianism is marshaled in by a guy by the name of Jeremy Bentham. So when we're looking at the Trolleology problem, all three of these do come into play. So let's start with rights. Last we asked, what does it mean to have unalienable natural rights? And John Locke says, as he sets off American democracy as we know it, and most important, one of the fathers of what we think of as capitalism. John Locke says we have three rights, among others. The first is a right to life. The right to life means I can't kill you. It does not mean that if I'm dying, you have to save me. We have a right to liberty. And this is about natural rights. That's what we're talking about. Natural rights. The right to liberty means that you can't enslave me, even though that doesn't mean that if I am in trouble, you need to give me liberty. So if I can't get across the street, you have no obligation to use your liberty to save me. So oddly enough, it's the idea of natural rights which allows the legalization of abortion. I know that might seem odd, because even though a fetus has a right to life, we have no moral obligation, according to natural rights, to exert our liberty to save its rights. So one of the peculiarities of natural rights is they're negative. They aren't telling you what I have to give to you. They're instead saying what you can't take from me and what I cannot take from you. And the final of the natural rights is estates. Or what we think of as property. And estates means I have gotten these rights from nature, essentially from the deist divinity. They come from a God. That God has given me the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to own stuff. And the way it works, I got life first, I then get to move around, and I get to use my labor to accumulate estates. That's the basic idea of natural rights. So the moral obligation of any community that believes in natural rights is to increase the liberty of all people, and that's generally done through education. If I educate you, then you have the ability to trade your labor for more stuff. As I often say, but it's a bit too dirty, if you don't know anything, you can't do anything. And if you can't do anything, you can't get anything. And usually I use a different word. But anyway, since this might go out into the public domain, I have to be careful. So that's natural rights. Your rights are in fact negative. It means no one can take them away from you. And the obligation of a government is to protect your rights. So when a presidential candidate says things like, I'm going to let you work at any cost you want, at any price you want, as much as you want, produce any product you want, and so forth, that's generally an idea of natural rights. And the extreme adherence to natural rights is called libertarian. And there is an enormous libertarian streak in America. For example, we all get the idea I can do whatever I want so long as I don't hurt you. What's good? So that is a basic libertarian view. If you would like to take drugs, but don't expect me to pay for your welfare. If you want to be a prostitute, but don't expect me to take care of you if things go badly. You can do whatever you want because it's maximizing your liberty, but don't expect me to have to use my liberty to save you. So this is what the libertarian says. Legalize drugs, legalize prostitution, legalize anything you want, and recognize that that's a maximization of liberty. No seatbelts, no helmets. There's no reason to force people to do things that are in their interest if you're a libertarian, because the goal is to maximize individual liberty. Now, there's some flaws with this, as we're going to see when we look at this Trolleology case. Now, there's another moral principle called deontology. So this is natural rights, and today we're going to talk about deontology. Deontology basically is the idea that you should never use people. Never treat a person as a means to an end. Always treat people as ends in themselves. That's the basic principle of deontology. Don't use people. People are not things to be used for your personal benefit. Now, the deontologist then would accept that there's rights, but if my rights means that I'm going to put you in a situation where you're going to be exploited, then I can't do it. The deontologist says, never lie. Well, that's a problem. The reason you never lie is because if I lie, I'm essentially limiting your liberty and not giving you autonomy. So the deontologist is concerned about liberty in his own way, but they describe it as autonomy, and heteronomy. And I know this blackboard is silly because you can't read my writing, but it's for me, not for you. Anyway, autonomy means self-driven. I make my own decisions, and as a human being, I should always be allowed to make my own decision. That's what the deontologist says. My dignity is based on my autonomy. However, sometimes I become overly emotional, or I become crazy or something. At this point, my decisions are made by my emotions, and they're not free. The only way to make a free decision is using reason. That's what Kant says. Whereas decisions based on emotion, fear, exhaustion, whatever, those are heteronymous, which means something else has driven you, like heterosexual, I like somebody other than myself. Well, there's other problems what would an autosexual be? But anyway, that's another concern. But the word heteronomy comes from hetero, which is different. Autonomy means self-driven. So the deontologist, when looking at these cars, in the Trolleology case, is going to say things like, well, you may have the right to make a car that always protects you, Mercedes-Benz, but do you also have a duty not to use other people? So this is going to be a problem. If I buy a car, though, and I'm thinking simply in terms of natural rights, I'm going to say that car should serve my interests. I have no mandatory duty, no obligation to take care of you. So I would like a car that's a selfish car. That's going to be my car to protect me, to protect my liberty. However, someone might say, well, if your car is going to somehow or another make it so that other people are used, well, then there's going to be a problem. Now, the big one that Trolleology is really all about is utilitarianism. So here's where we are so far. We've talked about rights, these negative rights that mean you can do as you please so long as your rights don't infringe on another. Deontology says never use people as a means to an end. So we have rights, deontology, and now we're going to look at utilitarianism. There's a utilitarian by the name of Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham says rights are nonsense. There's no such thing as rights at all. They are nonsense on stilts. And the reason he says that is he says rights are a myth. Where do you get these rights? Did they come from God? I mean, who invented this notion of rights? It's something that we think exists, but we think it because it makes us feel pleasure. The utilitarian says there's two things that drive all human behavior: pleasure and pain. The end. And all moral decisions from a utilitarian point of view is based on a kind of pleasure-pain calculus. Will this create more pleasure or will this create more pain? But it's not your pleasure or your pain. It's the total pain. So we're thinking now about something called policy. The utilitarian is always looking at policy. And this is where the car issue comes in. If I have a car that will always protect me, will it create more pleasure or more pain? In other words, if that car is going to protect me, it will allow a school bus of children to go off the cliff and die and save my life. That seems to me a much greater amount of pain than it is pleasure. So if you're a utilitarian, you say we have to forget about the individual and just weigh pain and pleasure like they were pounds. Like this will create 10 pounds of pain and this will create 20 pounds of pleasure. Which should we do? Well, the one that has the greatest total net benefit. That's the jargon. Net benefit. So here we see the problem with the robotic cars. The terrible story about the mother who kills her baby in order to save all the people. Was that a case of rights? Was she thinking as a utilitarian, or was she thinking as a deontologist? Well, certainly she was in a situation where she had to use her baby as a means to an end by killing it. That's a terrible thought. On the other hand, She had the right individually not to do it, but if she didn't do it, she and everyone else would have been killed. So that was a utilitarian decision. These things are commonly in conflict. Now let's look at the atomic bomb. Should the United States have bombed Hiroshima? Well, we used civilians. We did it solely for the benefit of terrorizing the Japanese to end the war. And the idea at the time was that if we kill a few 100,000 Japanese civilians, innocent civilians, we'll end a war that will save perhaps as many as 11 million lives, including 1 million American lives. So from a simple utilitarian calculus, pleasure v. pain, it looked like a good decision. We're going to kill these people to cause this good conclusion. So for the utilitarian, it's ends that matter. For the deontologist, it's not simply the ends. The deontologist says the ends do not justify the means if the means mean I'm using you. So when we thought about the idea of using people in the whole story about whether or not you should put somebody in the friend zone, well, that friend zone, unless you're really a friend, you're simply being exploited. You're being used as a means to an end. Either I'm going to keep you on the side to use you at my leisure, or I'm going to push you away so I can cause you to do something. I'm using you like a tool. So the friend zone is the zone where you keep tools. Now, some people in the friend zone would say, I'm not really an enemy, so I'm just going to orbit about and wait for them to become weak and land. Well, that's also the person in the so-called friend zone is acting very much not like a friend. So you can be orbiters or you can be sidelined. But the point is the friend zone is not a place where you are respecting an individual. You are using that person as a means to an end. Do you have the right to put somebody in the friend zone? Absolutely. From a utilitarian perspective, is the friend zone a good thing? It all depends. I mean, it depends if the benefits, the relationship with benefits, if the benefits essentially overweigh the harms. So if you can say, I get more pleasure from being in the friend zone than not, and they get more pleasure from being putting in the friend zone than not, then from a utilitarian point of view, you could say the friend zone is not immoral. Now to the cars. Should you push the fat man off the bridge? I know. Then there's the large man, and then there's all the problems with fat shaming. But this was an old analogy, long before we all became so politically correct and sensitive. The point was, and this was a bunch of women philosophers, some very brilliant women, they came up with this idea of the Trolleology problem. Should you kill one large person to save 5 other people? Should you pull the lever on the track that will guarantee to kill one person in order to save 5 other people? Is it simply utilitarian? And why is that pulling the lever hurts less emotionally than pushing somebody off the bridge? Why is that? And so the question then is there something emotional involved? And that's a lot of what you're hearing in that Trolleology. But from our perspective, we want to look at it in terms of, would you have a policy when it comes to self-driving cars that would protect the most people, or should you have a policy when it comes to creating self-driving cars that the person who buys the car should get the car that he wants, since I have no duty to save your life? My only duty is to make sure I don't take away your unalienable natural rights. So there you have it. Deontology: never treat a person as a means to an end, always treat people as ends in themselves. Utilitarianism: what's ever going to create the greatest net benefit is what you should do. And rights: I have the right to do as I please so long as I don't take your rights from you. Thank you very much. Hope that clarifies a few things.